Good morning, it's Bobby. Welcome back to my quilting studio. I hope you had a great time unpacking all of your kit, getting your fabrics together and pulling all your tools together. Now that we've done that, we're going to be ready to get started on our cutting and our sewing. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this video. This video, because it's the first month, is going to be a little bit longer. Don't feel like you have to watch it all at one time. You can break it up into segments. But many are new to legit kits, and so I want to be a little more detailed in this first month. Following months, we'll review, we'll talk about things unique to that month, and we may show some additional techniques or methods you might want to use as you go along and try out as well. But this month will be a little bit longer. With that, we're ready to get started because we want our quilt to start to come to life. So get everything ready and join me as we begin to pull our tools out and start with the cutting process. If you take a look here, you can see that I have the cut guides for each of the colors that we have the fabric in the first month one packet that we received. So you want to get those out because we're going to refer to those. In addition to that, the pattern pieces that we'll be using to determine how big to cut our fabric will ultimately be sewing on these. We have those for the blocks A1 and A2. Those are the two blocks we're going to work on this month. And so we'll want to get those out so that we can use those. Now, as I mentioned in the previous videos, I use these binders that have alphabetic tabs on them in order to store my fabrics. So whichever way you have chosen to store your fabrics, just make sure they're organized and usually alphabetic so that you can quickly get to them and refer to them as we get ready to cut. And they'll be easy to find. You'll want that. I take, and as I cut the pieces of fabric out, I pin them to the proper place on the paper piecing pattern. And that way it's easy for me to find them and know which part they go to. I also have some clips. I use the clips in this part of the process primarily to keep all of the pieces, the segments that go into block A1 together and the A2 blocks together. That way I don't get them commingled. We're going to be cutting, so we need a rotary cutter. When I check off what I have already cut on my cut guide so I can keep up with what I've done, I use a heat erase pen so that I can reuse those papers later and easily take my markings off, but right now be able to tell what it is I've marked off and completed and what I still need to do. And then on occasion, sometimes to get the proper feel for where we are in our cutting lines, it may be necessary to fold back on one of the fold lines during the cutting process. So I have my folding template here as well. And then you'll see I have my light table here. And today, instead of the gridded mat, I have a mat that has no grids on it, so it's easier to see through. Those are the tools that we'll be working with today as we prepare to cut our papers and our fabric and get ready to sew. So as we do this, the first thing you'll need to do is simply to take these newsprint papers and you want to cut them out. Now some of you like to use rotary cutters or scissors that are specific for paper cutting or for fabric cutting. And with scissors I do that, but with my rotary cutter when I'm paper piecing, there are times when you're trimming the blocks after you've sewn all the fabrics on where you'll be trimming off paper and fabric at the same time. So since I know I'm going to be cutting paper at some point with my rotary cutter, I just pay attention that I have a good sharp blade in, and I do not worry about using a different rotary cutter for paper and fabric. If you choose to do that, you'll want to use your paper one for this step, and for the next step you'll want to get your fabric one. I'm going to use the same one all the way through. So as I get ready to cut this, I'm going to get it at an angle that's just simple for me to get to. And I'm not even going to use a ruler to do this part. I'm simply going to exercise caution not to get my fingers cut, but I want to cut anywhere from 1/8 to 3/8 of an inch or so from the edge of this gray portion. So I'm just cutting that off so that I can easily get to this paper when I want to do it. Now, safety says cut away from yourself, so we want to try and do that. I'm going to cut down between these two pieces, and so I've got one piece cut out. So A1A segment is cut out for the paper, and then I'm going to do A1B, which is the next piece on here. And you can see I'm not using a ruler. I'm simply taking this rotary cutter, staying away from the gray, but getting it small enough that I just don't have all this excess to the side as I'm working with it. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out all the papers that I have for both block A1 and A2. And once I complete that, I'll be back and we'll start again to begin to cut our fabrics. You go ahead and cut all your papers out. Once you have all of A1A together, you simply want to take them and in some method keep them together. The way I do it is I simply put a clip on them. So once I finish cutting all my A1s, they'll all be clipped together. All my A2s will be clipped together. You complete that, and then when you come back, we'll begin to cut some fabric. All right, welcome back. It is time to take a look at what we've done. So we have cut, and I hope you've completed cutting out the papers for blocks A1 and A2. So that wasn't too bad, pretty quick, and very rough cut. So the precision in paper piecing comes when you're actually doing the sewing. The cutting is not as precise, and it's fairly forgiving, and the amount of fabric that you're given in your kit makes it so that even if you make a mistake, it's pretty easy to have enough left over to fix that error. If for some reason the error caused you not to have enough fabric left, then you can contact the company and they will send you what you need in order to correct that error. So at this point, let's take a look at the cutting process. And in this case, I'm going to set these pieces aside and I'm going to go to my cutting guide. So the first cutting guide and the first color that I have is color AC Coated, and the color is Asparagus. We're using this in the confetti cottons, and so Asparagus is coated AC by Legit Kit for that particular fabric line. When we look at this paper, we see that we're given a 1/16 of a yard, a fat 1/16, and when we lay this out on the paper, this is not the exact size of everything, but it does show you that there's a way to lay all the necessary pieces out for both of these blocks and have a lot of white space in here. You see the white space? That tells you you can be a little generous in your cutting because you're going to have plenty of fabric in order to cut out the pieces that you have. So you'll probably have some leftovers. You can see the next piece over here is Peacock, coated AD, and you can see this one also has a lot of white space. You'll find as you work your way through the cutting process that there'll be many of these that will have a lot of white space, which means you can be fairly generous with your cutting. If for some reason it looks very crowded on the page, you'll want to pay attention to being a little more precise with your cutting. But if not, then you have a lot of latitude in exactly how you're going to cut this. So the first thing I do when I cut these is I go to the first fabric color and I look at this list right here. The list tells me that I'm going to be cutting the fabric piece A1B, and I'm going to be cutting the fabric number 2 off of that particular segment out of AC. Then I'm also going to cut A1D, and I'm going to cut the fabric piece number 3 from that segment. I'm going to cut off a piece that will go with A1F, and that'll be piece number 3 for that particular segment. A1G, I'll be cutting piece number 2. The next 3 will be A2, block A2, and there'll be 3 that I'll be cutting from there. Because these are numbered, I can tell on here which ones will be for A1, block A1, and block A2. block A1 will be pieces 1 through 4. So that'll be 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, if I had one of these where one of these pieces was really large and it was going to need to go all the way down the side of the piece or all the way across the bottom in order to have enough space to fit it on there, even if it were in block 2, I can tell that as I'm cutting A1, if it's one of these 5, 6, and 7 numbers, I'll need to leave an area that is that large in order to cut that piece when I get to it. You can either go get that piece right then and cut it to ensure you have enough space, or you can use your cutting guide to let you know that you need to leave a chunk that is roughly that much of your piece of fabric. Either way you choose to do that, it will work just fine. Now, as I cut these, I'm going to check them off with my heat erase pen. That way I can simply touch a warm iron to this later if I want to reuse this and make another one. And by doing that, it will simply erase those check marks that I had on there. But I do check them off as I go so that I can keep track of what I have done. So let's go ahead and pull. We just want to cut right now. What I do is cut one block at a time. And so we're going to cut pieces from pieces A1B, A1D, A1F, and A1G. So I go over here where I've clipped together all the segments for A. And I began to look for this number right here. That's what equates to these numbers that are on my list. So I'm looking for A1B, D, F, and G. So I'll put A aside. You'll see this one is A1B. So I'm going to keep it. This is A1G, and A1G is on here, so I'm going to keep it. I am not keeping A1C because it's not on my list for this color, so I'll set it over here. A1D is on my list, so I'm going to keep it. A1H is not on my list, so I don't need to keep that. A1F is on my list, and so I'm going to keep that. So I will clip these back together because I want to keep them together as I go, and I'll set them back over here out of the way. And I'm going to be working with these 4 pieces. Now, as you can see, I'm looking for the letters AC. And in A1F, which is the piece I have here, it tells me that it's part number 3 that I'm going to be cutting out. So if I look on here, I can see I have A1F, part 3, and the lettering on here is AC, which matches this. So that's how you know that you have everything in the right place and that this is what we're going to cut. So let's go ahead and move, for the time being, this over out of the way. I'm going to get out a piece of AC fabric. Now, if you do a lot of legit kits, you're going to find out that you use some of these colors in multiple kits. And because you have leftovers when you cut, you may be able to use a piece of a leftover in order to cut your pieces. So I have one here that I've already cut some off of, and I'm going to use it to cut my A1C. This is A1D, and I'm looking for the letter AC, and you can see I find it right here. So in this case, I'm going to take it, and you don't have to put it in the same place the cut guide had it, as long as you know you've left enough space for everything you're going to be cutting. I'm going to come over here, and you can see with my light table that there is a dark ridge here. I can tell I have fabric that is at least a 1/4 inch seam under the line that'll be sewn here. This is the edge of it, so it just needs to be outside of the gray. And then I'll want to make sure that I give at least a 1/4 inch here. I'm usually a little generous with that. Because it's easier for me to get to the place I'm going to cut, if I can fold back these other pieces, I'm going to take my folding template and I'm going to go ahead and fold this back. Now, I don't need a ruler for this because it is a rough cut, and I'm simply making sure I have plenty of room for my 1/4 inch seam. So I can simply cut through here, pull this away, and you'll see that this is a generous 1/4 inch seam. And if I take the piece I've just cut and lay it on top of the A1C piece, I can tell it's going to be plenty over here, plenty here, and if I put it under the paper on the light table, I can tell that I have plenty for a generous 1/4 inch seam on each side of the sew lines. And so once I've done that, so that I can tell where it goes, I'm going to put a pin in it to keep it right there with that piece. I'm going to go to my cut guide, and I'm going to take my heat erase pen, and this was A1D. So I'm going to check off that I have completed cutting A1D. Now once I set that aside, I can pick up the next piece that I need. This is A1G, and I'm looking for an AC. So you can see an AC right here, okay? That will be the next one I want to cut. So I'm going to come over here to this area, and if now this is a solid color, so it's the same on both sides. There's no front and back to this fabric, so I can flip it over if it gives me a better angle to be able to preserve fabric and do my cut. So look at what happens when I come up here and look at my A1C. I have plenty here for a 1/4 inch. This is going to cover, and if I fold this back, there's plenty of room to create a 1/4 inch there. So I'm going to use my folding template just as I did before. I'm going to fold that paper back, and I'm going to make sure I have it a good 1/4 inch on this. I'm going to go down this way, and then I'm going to pick this up and move this out of the way because I know I'm down there low enough, and I'm going to cut that direction. Now then, when I finish this, I'll flip this back over so I see I have my AC fabric. And if I lay this down on top of this, I'm covering everything I need to. Let's get that in the camera a little bit better. There we go. You can see I'm covering everything I need to. When I put this on top of it with the light table, we can see this. Now, what if you don't have a light table and you're trying to figure out if you have cut with enough space here? Well, if I simply lay it down there, raise up this edge to the line, there's plenty there, hold it in the same place, and raise up this edge to the line, I can see there's plenty left over there. And I know it's covering the area where I have come off for my seam line. So in this, even without a light table, I can easily tell that I have cut a piece that will cover. Again, I'm going to get me a pin. I'm going to pin that on to where it goes to keep track of what I have completed. I'm going to come back, and this was A1G, and so I'm going to check off A1G. Move that out of the way. And the next one I'll be doing, I accidentally picked up one more than I should have because A1E is not on my cut guide list for AC. Now, if that happens, look at this. If I look on A1E, there is no AC on here. Since there's no AC on here, I know I've picked it up nearer, and I can look at my cut guide, and I can see, oh, there's no A1E. It was just smaller and lightweight, and I grabbed it by accident, and it got stuck in there. So I'm going to put it back with my other A1s. Now I'm going to get A1B. And A1B, if I look across the different pieces, has an AC. This AC will easily fit right here. So I can put it here, and with my light table, or by lifting the paper, I can see there's a generous 1/4 inch there. I can see that this outer gray line for my seam line when I connect my segments is covered. And then I have plenty of space over here to be able to get a 1/4 inch seam in. Again, there's a piece in the way for me cutting. I don't want to cut the paper off. So to get to the area I'm going to cut, I'm going to use my folding template, and I'm going to fold it back and generously cut so that I have a 1/4 inch. The same thing when I finish. I'm going to take a look, see that it will cover everything. I can tuck it underneath, and with the light table or by lifting the different sides, I can tell that I have plenty for a 1/4 inch seam on each side of the sew lines, and I can take a pin, pin that in place, set that one aside. Now we know we had 4 pieces, and I have checked off now A1B, so I should have one A1 piece left for this color, A1F. When I pull A1F, you can see I have, of these 5, I have one AC. So that's the piece I'm going to cut. I'm going to find what works for me best on here, and if I set it against this line, you can see that I can cut all the way here. It covers a generous 1/4 inch. I'm covering all of my gray lines, and I need to fold back some pieces so that I can see where to cut along that line. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and slip this out because it'll be in the way as I cut along this side. So you can see that I needed to take it out so that I have plenty of space to cut along this way, come up, leave a 1/4 inch because this is a seam line. This is the edge of my segment. So I need to come up, go over beyond a 1/4 inch, and then come across. So we'll take our rotary cutter, and we're just going to do generous cuts because we know we have plenty of fabric. I'm going to fold this back, and then I'm going to cut across this direction. Okay, look at that. I used one I'd already cut from, and I still have plenty left. And those are the 4 that I needed to cut from this particular fabric for block A1. There are 3 more pieces we'll cut out of this for block A2, but we'll do that as we get to that block. So we have this one done. We want to remember to check that off. So when I come back to this, when I'm doing A2, I can see that I've already cut these 3 pieces. And I'm going to be cutting pieces 5, 6, and 7 when I get to my A2 block. So here's block 5, 6, and 7. Those will be the pieces that I'll end up cutting when I get to that portion. But for now, those are the pieces that we're going to cut. Once I've done that, I take these pieces, I put them back together with my other A1 pieces because I want to keep them all together. And while you're cutting these, you could have a place where you simply keep them all separated from everything else and laid out on your table without the clip, or you can clip them back together. As you get more pieces of fabric on there, they're going to get thicker, and that's okay. So you can either use a larger clip, or you can simply keep them separated or put them into a Ziploc bag in order to keep them together. But I'll be able to set these aside. I can take my fabric AC and I can put it back in my A's, and I'm ready to go to the next fabric. So at this point, I've shown you how to do the basic cutting of your fabric so that you can get all your pieces cut together. I'm going to continue cutting my blocks A1 and A2 fabric pieces and pinning them to my papers so that I'll be ready to sew. So as I go through doing this, I'm going to go off camera because you probably don't want to sit and watch me cut a bunch of pieces of fabric. As I see something that I want to emphasize or show you that maybe wasn't as obvious in the pieces we've just cut, then I will come back to the camera and I will show you what that portion is. After you and I have finished cutting all of our fabric pieces for these 2 blocks, and pinning them to the papers, we'll be ready to sew. So at that point, we'll come back and we will begin the sewing process, and we'll talk about how we approach that. So you go ahead and get busy, begin cutting your pieces, and I'll pop back in now and then as I have something that I want to emphasize. I wanted to come back for just a moment and show you an area where on color FI, we see that there is a piece that needs to go in a certain area of what we cut. So if I pull out my cut guide for F1 and I look at the 3 pieces I need to cut, you'll see it's 1, 2, and 3. They're all for block A1, or I'm sorry, 1 is for block A1 and 2 are for block A2. So this A1A piece, look at how this piece goes all the way up the side of the piece that you have. So you want to make sure that you preserve an edge. If this were in block A2 and we were not going to cut it until we got to A2, we would want to make sure that we cut these other 2 pieces from an area that still left us a long side. But if we are cutting it first, as we are in this case, we can simply go ahead and cut it out, and it will make sure that we have plenty of fabric. But I did want to stop and show you that even though there'll be lots of leftover fabric, this particular piece is going to take a large side of the piece of fabric that we were given. So make sure you don't cut something that takes the whole bottom and doesn't leave enough room and the room at the top is not big enough to cut this piece out of. You want to make sure you have a long side left when you finish cutting these pieces. Okay? So as you continue with your cutting, just make sure you attend to anything that comes up where you have this sort of a situation. I'm back one more time. I want to show you one other thing that's a little bit different way to get to the edges of the piece you're cutting so that you can work through getting it cut the right shape. When we had looked at the other segments that we had cut in the beginning, they were mostly so that we could put an edge of a sew line down on an edge of the fabric, and then we had some other places where we could fold that back and cut, and that pretty much took care of it. In this case, we have a piece when we are looking at VT and it tells us to use piece A1G. This piece it's set up so that it has sew lines on all 3 sides. So there's no edge that is the outer seam. So we're going to need to leave a good 1/4 inch seam on all 3 sides of this piece. Now you can still take and line up a piece here, and it has plenty of room here. Because I had a cut out of this already, I can sort of line this up here. As long as I can turn it so that I can get that on there. So I know I've got a generous 1/4 inch seam here, and if I move this up a little bit, I'll have a generous 1/4 inch seam here, and that will work that way. And then I'll simply have to fold back this portion. Well, what if this didn't have that cut line there, and I had to do that? I would simply fold up one side and make my cut using my folding template, and then I would keep everything held in place and fold the other side. Now you see in this case, I've pinned a piece of fabric here and it's kind of bulky and in the way. So when I take my folding template and I fold this back, because in this case, this is the one I'm going to need to fold back in order to get to it, I can fold this back and pull that fabric back there too. So then I'm not going to cut that piece of fabric. I don't have to unpin it and take the chance of it getting repinned in the wrong place so that I'm then confused on my block. And I can cut my generous 1/4 inch seam just like that. Look at that. I didn't move my paper, and so I probably cut my paper. I sure did, but that'll be all right. Okay, so when I cut that, I can now tell that I have covered this entire thing. I can put it with the light table or on something else where I can flip this up and tell that on all three sides I have a generous 1/4 inch seam. Once I've done that, then I can pin this and I can take this marker and mark here. Now, I made a mistake. I cut on top of this paper, and I may want to use it again. That's why I'm using that heat erase pen. So what am I going to do to keep that from getting caught on things? I'm simply going to turn it over, and I have washi tape that I use to repair pattern pieces. I'm simply going to use it to repair this. I just take off a piece and clip it and put it right here on the back so that I don't cover up anything I might need to read or see later. And it now has covered up and keeps that from pulling apart where I cut it. You can do that with a pattern piece or with any of your papers that this happens to. And you can try not to be forgetting things like I do. But when you do forget something, this is forgiving enough that we can usually find a way to fix it. With that, I'm going to let you get back to your cutting, and I'll see you back here when it's time to start sewing. So I hope you've got all your pieces cut and put together and pinned to your paper pieces. So now it's time to sew. To get started, I've selected our segment A1D for us to be able to sew together. Once we get this one put together, then I'll let you continue the sewing on your own for the other segments. But we want to do one together so you can see how I go about doing this. Now in this, when I start, I begin to unpin these pieces in reverse order. So this particular segment has 6 pieces in it. And I have all of those fabrics cut and pinned to the back. And I'm going to begin with piece number 6. I'm going to take that pin out, and relative to this piece, when it's set right side up, this piece will be in this far left corner. Then I'm going to take the pin out of piece 5, and I'm going to set it right here next to it in the same way it's configured on the paper. We'll go to piece 4 next. I'm going to pull it out from here, and I'm going to set it in the place it will go. In the next one is piece 3, and I'm going to put it right here. So you can see as I'm working my way up this piece, I have piece 6, piece 5, piece 4, and piece 3. This helps me to make sure that because these colors are no longer labeled, I don't want to have to go back and find that piece of fabric and double check and see that I have the right color in the right place if I don't have to. So this organization method is what I use in order to keep these straight. Now, the first 2 pieces I'm going to sew together are pieces 1 and 2. So when I get to them, I'm going to take the pin out of piece 2. I'm going to lay it the way it's going to go against piece 1. And then I'm going to lay piece 1 right here. That way I can tell, again, relative to my paper, where do these 2 pieces go. Now, when we're going through this, you may, as you saw, have to do some folding with your folding template during the cutting process. But not every line will require folding during that process. So at this point, we're going to be sewing first on the line that falls between piece 1 and piece 2. I'm going to take my folding template and I'm going to fold that back so I get a nice crease. Once I've done that, I'm going to pull this back and I'm going to lay piece 1 so that it's going to fit underneath the paper. It's going to be covered so that I have at least a 1/4 inch on each seam line that I'm going to need to take, and that the edge that is in this gray part falls outside of the gray. Once I've done that and I have this piece folded down, I'm going to look and I'm going to scoot it over so that I know that I have a 1/4 inch, making sure that I still have all this same coverage. When I do that, when I glue my fabrics, anytime I'm gluing paper to fabric, I'm going to use this repositionable glue stick because it's a little bit easier for me to make sure that I can get the paper off of it when I go to pull the paper out. If I use the other glue stick that I showed you earlier, it will put me in a position where it's going to stick more to the fabric, and I'll have to use some damp cloth or a little bit of water of some sort to get that to come off easier, and that's just an extra step I'd prefer to avoid. So once I know that this will fit, everything is looking right, I can see through the light table where my lines are. And I'm going to only on piece 1, and preferably inside of this gray seam line, I'm just going to lightly put just a little bit of this repositionable glue on the back, very lightly. I'm going to go back to this piece 1 with my seam line folded down, and I'm going to position it so that I have that 1/4 inch roughly. It doesn't have to be exact. You don't want it to be less than an 1/8, but you're shooting for around a 1/4. And I'm going to have that so that this now is stuck to it. It's going to hang on to it. It's not going to go anywhere. I know it's going to stay where I want it to be. I can check, even if I don't have a light table, that along this gray line, I've covered and I have fabric off of that. I know I have it here because that's what I checked first. I do have a seam line on this side, so I do want to make sure that there's plenty for a 1/4 inch seam over here, and there is. So I'm going to fold this back down, and I want this piece that was designed to cover piece number 2 of fabric, I want it to go underneath. If I were doing this, I would have right sides together. If this were fabric that had a right and a wrong side, because we're using solids, we don't have to do that. But if you were doing this, remaking this with your own fabrics that were not double-sided like this, you would need to make sure that the wrong side is what you glued to the paper and that you put right sides together when you flip this underneath. Now, if you flip this underneath and you line up those 2 edges so that you have essentially a 1/4 inch seam for both, you're looking for 2 things. You're looking to make sure that at these ends, not the end of the paper, but the end of where this gray line is, that this yellow is covering both ends and sticking out. So you've got a little bit extra. You've got it lined up with that 1/4 inch, minus, slip just a little bit. And you want to make sure that when this paper folds over, it's all covered by yellow. So it's folded over right there, and you can see this yellow piece is coming out here, and it comes to a point to cover it. Remember, you cut this so it only has to cover the gray. And then on this end, you want to, again, just kind of flip this up and make sure that the yellow is covering it, and it is. So we know that when we sew this on this line, flip the paper back over, and then after the seam is in, press that piece of fabric back this direction. It will cover everywhere the paper is. That's our goal, is that every bit of the paper that's inside the gray line is going to be covered when we get our sewing done. Now, if you are well versed at paper piecing and comfortable simply picking this up and taking it to the sewing machine, you can do that. But if you're new at this, or if it's your habit, I find that it keeps things in place so that they don't start slipping around on me if I use this fabric glue when I put these together before I take it to the sewing machine. So to do that, I'm simply going to get this so that I can peel this up. I'm going to put just a little of this glue into the seam line. Doesn't have to be a solid line, just enough to kind of grab and hold it. And I'm going to lay that down, and you can see now when I pick it up, both pieces are staying with me. Now this glue I try and keep in the seam line just because it's not as messy, but it is water soluble. So if you get outside the seam line and it makes, it dries and it looks a little different, it's not going to discolor your fabric. You're just going to have to get some damp cloth and wash that off, and it'll come right out because it is water soluble. So don't panic if that happens. It's not a problem. I just like to skip that step when I can. So now we have this so that we can fold the paper back over. We can see our seam line. When we go to the machine, I'm going to use 80 weight thread. Let me show you that. So this is, I use Deco Bob by Wonderfeel. It is an 80 weight thread. The larger the number of your thread weight, the thinner the thread is. You can see on this piece that we have a spot where we're going to sew some things together. We're going to have these 5 pieces all come together in one seam. That's going to make a lump, a bump, or a bulky spot within our fabric and our pattern. And the more we put in that spot, the fatter and the thicker it's going to be. So if you use a lighter weight thread, a thinner thread, it will simply make this not be as thick as it could be. Because the fabric has to be in there, we know we can thin the thread out, and that will help. Okay? The other thing I do is I take, if I'm on newsprint, I change my stitch width to roughly 1.5 or 1.5. If I had made a copy of this onto regular copy paper, I would make it even smaller, a 1 or a 1.2. That's going to make it a little harder if you have to take the seam out because the stitches will be tinier, but it will make it easier to tear the paper. Now, one way to fix that, even if you have to use a copy, Legit Kits sells packets of blank newsprint paper. You get 500 sheets in the packet, and you can use that to make your copies instead of regular copier paper. If you do that, then you can continue to use that 1.5 inch or 1.5 stitch length in order to sew, even if it's onto a copy. And you won't have the difficulty of copier paper in pulling that out, where you have to shorten that stitch. And if you do make a mistake, it's easier to take that stitch out. So now we're going to move to the sewing machine. I'm going to keep the bulk of the fabric to the left, just like when I'm sewing in a traditional quilt piecing method. And I'm going to keep my seam line to the right, because that's the way I typically take it through there. I'm going to use my open toe foot only because it allows me to see this line a little bit easier when I sew. When I go through this, and I want to be able to show you this fairly precisely, I am not an exceptional straight line sewer. So my lines can get a little weavy when they go through here. People will tell you, you can paper piece if you can sew a straight line. Well, I'm here to tell you and prove to you that you don't have to sew a perfectly straight line in order to paper piece. The 2 places you want to pay special attention to try and make sure you're on the line are when it crosses a seam point. So see where the gray seam line is, and this is where the line crosses. And then again here, where the gray seam line is, right here where it crosses into that. Those are the 2 points we want to do our very best to be on the line. If there is a minor weave along this line, it's not the end of the world, and I would not take it out because I do that routinely, and I'm fine with my quilts. But if it's a major weave somewhere along here, then you may need to take it out because it won't lay properly. So we'll take it to the machine now, and we'll sew that seam, and then we'll open it up. When I get it to the machine, I try and bring my needle down a little bit so I know that when it comes down, it's going to hit at that line. In the case of my machine and my foot that is open-toed here, I have a little mark at the back, and that's lined up with my needle. So I can actually guide this line so that it hits that mark. It stays with that mark. And so I don't have to watch the needle that's going up and down. I can simply take and do this. Now, because the machine is sitting here and it's going to vibrate some, you may be seeing some vibration in the camera. That's okay. We'll be done in just a moment. It's a real short scene. I do slow the speed down on my machine. This is going a little bit slower because of the fact that I am pushing the presser foot lighter, which is what you can do if you don't have an adjustment on your machine to be able to slow the speed down. I have a leader ender piece at the end of this, and it is keeping me from having to cut my thread after each of these. A little like your chain piecing. I keep the needle in the up position when I'm doing this because I'm going to snip this, and because I have the camera in the way, this is going to look a little awkward, but it's going to work. There we go. And I'm going to raise my presser foot up so that I can pull that back, and I will put my leader ender back in here, and then I'm going to pull this up and pull this back, and I'll be ready to begin sewing again the next time when I get the next seam ready. We'll snip that, and we're ready to come back over here. Now, I want to show you what we do to press this. Now, the pressing can be very important. Because there is so much pressing needed as you go from piece to piece in paper piecing, I do set up a pressing table next to my sewing space instead of having to get up and go to my big ironing station. That allows me to get through these a little bit quicker, but you can get more exercise if you decide to get up and down each time and move over to the ironing board that you have across the room to be able to do this. Now, I mentioned to you that I use this Acorn Easy Press pen. It's just starch, but it's starch in a pen that you can prime, and this tip allows that starch to flow right onto the seam line. So I'm not having to spray the whole piece. I press down, that primes it, and I just rub it across there. And you can see where it changed color a little because it got wet. I have a little travel iron. Mine happens to be an Oliso. I like it. It's fun. It has a headlight. And you can see that when I'm doing this, it has a little headlight on it. So when I'm pressing, I take this and I just push it gently against that seam line and hold it there long enough for it to dry out that starch so it's not wet anymore. And when I finish, I have this crisp seam. Now, one of the reasons I take this and I push it across this way from the top is I need to be able to pay attention, especially at the ends of the seams, that I'm not getting a crease in there. If I get a little crease in this when I press it, then what's going to happen is it's not going to lay properly when I go to match one piece up to another in this segment to another segment. And I'll have to work with it a little bit or take it out and redo it. So sometimes your sewing can be perfect, but your pressing causes a problem. So be careful when you're doing this. Watch and make sure you don't have a little bit of a crease or a tuck in here that's not supposed to be here. But if you use that Acorn pen, a little bit of starch in that seam line, it will keep this seam a little bit crisper. And remember, I talked about the thread weight and how we wanted to use the thread weight to thin this down and to keep it flatter, not as much bulk in a spot. Let the fabric be the only bulk that you have to have in there as much as possible. Then when you press it this way, it also flattens that out well enough that you don't have quite as much bulk. Now let's look at what we need to do to get our third piece put onto these two pieces that we've already done. Okay, so when we come back to our space where we have all this laid out, we're going to lay this piece so it is right side up. We're reading this right side up, and you know that we laid these out so that we have our fabrics that are going to be sewn into pieces 3, 4, 5, and 6. We have 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the same configuration and the same order on the area we laid it out. The next thing we need to do is we need to fold the next line we're going to sew. We're going to sew on piece number 3, so this is the line we're going to sew on. We take our folding template, we lay it on that line, and we fold this over. Now look at how that came with me. It's because there's a little bit of that previous seam that was in the seam line. All I have to do is tug, and that will come loose. This is where we're going to use our add-a-quarter ruler. When we talked about the tools we use in paper piecing, this is the add-a-quarter ruler. Now it has a ridge right here on the back side. I take that ridge and I press it up against the area that I folded. That leaves 1/4 inch beyond the ridge, which is what is going to make my 1/4 inch seam. I'm then going to cut off this excess right up against that ruler. And we can throw that piece away. Once I've done that, I know where my 1/4 inch is going to go. The next thing I have to do is know that I'm going to be placing the piece number 3. And piece number 3, I've got this upside down now, so I'm going to take piece 3 and I'm going to, okay, which way does this go? Well, it doesn't go this way because it doesn't cover. We want this to slant the same way. So here are some tips to look for. This is the longest side when we look at these 3 sides, right? So if you look at your piece of fabric, you want your longest side to lay there, right? And then it will fit properly. Now when I fold this back, this is going to be reversed. But my longest side is still the side I'm going to sew on. So if I keep the longest side over where I'm going to sew and tuck the rest of it in this direction, then that will work best. You'll also notice that I have a fat end. Let's scoot that where you can see it better. I have a fat end here and I have a pointy end here. So once I flip it over, I want to keep the fatter end here and the pointy end here. You also notice when I flip it over that it's going to slant this away from this end for the fat end. So I want it so that it's slanting this direction. That way I know that it's going to be underneath what it's going to need to cover afterwards. I'm going to, just as before, line that edge up with this. Now what if I cut that kind of wonky and there wasn't a real straight edge here? Well, I can still lay it there, and once I've got it laid down, I can put the add-a-quarter back and I can trim off the waviness that was over here. So that won't be a problem if it's not a perfectly straight edge. Now I have this laid here. Just like before, I want to make sure everything's covered. So here is the edge of this piece. I'm going to flip it up, and yes, the fabric comes all the way to there. And over here, the piece goes to about right here. So I want to flip that up, and yes, that's covered. And that's going to be a seam line. So it's covered and it has at least 1/4 inch more sticking out. So I've got it in a place that's going to cover everything. At this point, I want to pick this up, get my sew line glue, and I'm going to, again, just put a little bit, space it down in that 1/4 inch seam area and press that down. I put the cap back on pretty quick, otherwise it dries out and gets gummy. Then I can pick it up and it's all together and ready to take to the machine. So when I take it to the machine, I'm going to sew down the line that connects piece 3. I'm going to keep the bulk of my fabric to the left, my seam line to the right. I'm going to be cautious that I'm on the line when I cross over this seam line, and then again when I cross over this seam line. Now let's do that. We're back at the machine. We have this laid down here. We're going to lower our needle just enough to tell that we're going to be on our line, and then we're going to begin to sew. Again, we're keeping our speed either with the way you control your foot pedal or with the way that you've adjusted the speed on your machine, and we're going to go down to the end. When I get to the end, I'm going to raise my presser foot, pull that back, and we're going to clip this leader ender off so we can put it right back under here and begin to sew again. And then we'll clip that off. Now, this won't be on camera because I'm not going to move the cameras around every single time, but I'm putting acorn starch on that seam. I'm taking my iron, I'm gently pushing and pressing that to the side and holding it until all the starch has dried out. All right, once I've done that, I'm checking to ensure that I don't have any tucks or puckers in here and nothing is out of place. I'm going to put it back in the same configuration so I can check and see that the next thing I'm going to sew is piece 4. When I look at my fabrics, I have piece 4 right here. That's the one that's up at the top. Then I can flip this over knowing which piece I'm going to be grabbing. I'm going to pull that away where I got in the seam line again. And I'm going to take my folding template and fold back on that line. Once I've done that, I can take my add a quarter ruler and I can trim right against that. I can toss that little bit of waste. I'm going to move this out of the way and I'm going to be putting this piece over here. Now I have it upside down again, and so the fat part is now over here and the skinny part here. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, and when I look at this longer piece, which is right here, is going to be on this side that I'm going to sew. So when I tuck it under, I'm going to keep the long side on under here, but against where I'm going to sew, and I'm going to keep the fat end on that end, and where this slopes this way, I'm going to make sure that's where this is sloping. And when I get it under here, you'll notice this is one where I have a little bump there. It's not a perfectly straight line that I'm lining up. So I can put my add a quarter ruler there, and I can just trim off that little piece and toss it aside. Now it's nice and straight just like I wanted it. If I take a look, this is going to come here, and you can see that I have piece number 4 sticking out on both ends. So it's going to cover that. The edge of piece 4 is about right here. So when I turn that up, and that's going to be a sew line later, I can tell there's plenty for a 1/4 inch. And when I turn this up against that edge, I can tell I have plenty sticking out here. So I'm good to go ahead and glue those 2 pieces of fabric together in the seam line. So I'm going to pull this up. Take my glue, I'm going to put just a little in the seam line, just enough to hold it. I'm going to press that down. This will go back to the machine and we're going to sew that seam. I'm going to raise this up and pull my leader ender out of the way. I will lower my needle just enough to make sure I'm lined up. And then I'm going to begin to sew, paying attention that as I cross a seam line, I'm on the line. And again, as I approach another seam line, I want to be right on the line. I can now pull my presser foot up. You know, the beauty of this is all our seams, for the most part, are pretty short. Once in a while, we get a longer one. But it'll never be longer than a sheet of paper because that's how big these are, until we begin to put the blocks together into the quilt. We can clip that off. I want my needle in the up position. Raise this and pull this back. I'll go to the ironing station and press this one just as I have before. Putting my acorn starch down the seam and simply gently pressing that back and holding it until all of the starch has dried up from the heat. I'm going to check it for any tucks or creases that could be in that seam line. I don't see any, so I'm going to flip it back over and again put it right side up so I can tell the next I've added piece 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to add piece 5. When I look over here at these pieces, what's laid out here is this piece is going to be piece number 5. In this case, I'm going to flip it upside down. I'm going to pull away from that seam line where I went a little bit further so that I have that loose. If you didn't do that, then it would come up when you go to fold it and you can pull it away then. I'm going to take my folding template and fold this over, lay down my add a quarter ruler, and I'm going to trim that. Make sure with that angle that I'm holding it that I'm pressing down hard enough to get through that seam. This is where all those seams are going to start coming together. It's going to get a little bit thicker. I'm now moving this away. And again, I've turned this upside down, so I'm going to have to flip this over a little bit. I want the fat end on this side, and the skinny end on this side, because that's the way it is on my pattern piece. These sides are roughly the same, only it's longer this way. So we want to make sure this short end is here, but either of these could end up being the side that we put underneath. So we're going to fold this back, and I'm going to line up this with this and make sure that piece 4 is sticking out over the end here and over the end here. So we know it's sticking out, it's lined up. We're going to double check if we pick this up that it's covering here, and we're going to double check where we would pick this up right there that it covers and it has enough for the next seam line, because this side is a seam side. It does. So now I can raise up the top layer, holding this in place where it's going to be. I can take my fabric glue, put just a little into the seam line, and press that down. It's going to hang on, and I can take it to the sewing machine just as I did before. When I get to the sewing machine, I'm going to do the same thing I've done before. I'm going to lower my needle enough to know it's going to line up. I'll begin sewing, paying attention as I cross the seam line, and then again as I get to the next seam line that I'm on the line. With the needle in the up position, I can move this, get my leader ender over here, clip that, and be ready to press. So I think by now you're starting to get the hang of what we're doing. It is pretty straightforward. While paper piecing can be a little intimidating, when you stop and look and go, oh my, what do I do with this? It really is just a very repetitive process with just a few steps. The seam lines and sewing on the lines keep the precision, and you are simply making sure everything is covered. So now we have it right side up. We have one more piece to add. That would be piece number 6, and it's still right here where we put it. Knowing that we have that there, we can come over here and take our folding template, fold on our next seam line so we get that nice and crisp, pull that away. We'll take our add a quarter ruler, lay it up against that line, and we're going to trim that excess off. We'll throw that little bit away. And then I'm going to pull this out of here. And this was cut so that it would cover this. And I had to turn it, you see, a time or two to make sure that I had it in a configuration that would actually cover the piece. Because even though it looks like just a regular triangle that any side might fit, this is not cut so that it'll fit. So I had to turn it so I knew it would fit. Now I know it'll fit. I know this is the side that's going to be next to my seam line. So when I tuck this under, I know that I'm going to put this part that's against the seam line right there. Now look at this. When I do this, this is further than here. So to fix that, I'm simply going, I know from the top it's going to fit. So I'm simply going to slide it that direction until I know it's covered. Okay? So here I can flip this up and see that that gray doesn't start. Well, I said I could flip it up. There we go. There's the corner of the gray right there, and so it is still on the fabric, and I'm good. So I got it in a spot that that's covered. If I raise it up over here, this is covered, and I've got my 1/4 inch seam laid out here. So I'm in a good spot to be able to sew and make sure that works. Before I move it to my machine so that I can keep everything together, I'm going to put a little bit of glue right in the seam line. I now have it attached, and I can bring it back over here and go through the same process in my sewing. We'll scoot the leader ender out of the way. We'll put this in here and make sure when we lower our needle that we're here. We're going to make sure that we're on the line as we go across the seam line portions. Now be a little careful as you get over here, because see how thick this seam is starting to get, and it can cause it to waver. So I slow down a little extra here to make sure I'm on that line as I go across into the gray. And now I am to the end of that. I can come out here, put my leader ender back in place. Run it back through so I can clip off my piece, and I'm going to press that. Now remember I said this was the last piece we needed to add to this segment. So when we finish a segment and we have it all pressed, and we'll have that done in just one moment. All right, so we have it here, and it looks kind of funny because there's so much of it. When we flip it over, we've got all this hanging off the edges. So what do we do about that? We're going to take one of our rulers, and I remember I mentioned I like these where I can easily see a 1/4 inch, and it has some texture, and it's small. It's not going to be all over the place. I can keep it in a small area. I'm going to line this up, and when I line this up, there are little white lines. You find that stiletto again so I can point a little easier. You have little white lines out here in the edges. That's what I'm going to line up my 1/4 inch on. So instead of trying to see this fuzzy gray edge with the side of my ruler, I'm going to take this dark line, and on both ends I'm going to put it over that white line. That is an easier thing to see, and it will get me a 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to trim all the way down that. Okay. Move that out of the way. I'm going to turn this, and I'm going to find the white line on both ends. I'm going to line up the 1/4 inch line with that, and I'm going to trim that piece. Here I'm going to take this, line up the 1/4 inch line on the ruler with those white lines on either end. That's that thick spot. And trim that. Now here I don't have white lines, so I am going to need to line this up with the edge of that gray. And then I'm going to line up again with those 1/4 inch line on those white lines at both ends. And I'm going to trim that off. Now then, I can throw this excess away, We don't need it anymore. So it will go away. And you can see that I have piece A1D, and from the pattern side, it is all assembled and trimmed around the edges. I have my 1/4 inches. I have all my marking spots where I can put this together when it's time to assemble into a single block. And if I turn it over on the finished side, I can see all of my pieces coming together. So here's a point that's probably going to get matched when this gets put together. And here's a point where all of these came together. So it's a little thicker, but it's still where I can put that together. Okay? So now then, we see how we put these together. I want you to go in and take your pieces, your segments that you've cut out. And just as we've done this piece, I want you to assemble and trim all your segments for block A1. Once you've done that, we'll come back together and we'll see how to join these segments together so that you can put them into a block. You get busy with that, and I'll see you again real soon. Well, welcome back. I trust you've not run into any problems with sewing your pieces together. If you did, please let me know by emailing me in the email address that is shown on your screen. If you've had some sort of a problem that causes you to need a new pattern piece or a new piece of fabric in order to complete this, please reach out to the Legit Kit office, and they will let them know what it is that you need that got messed up, and they will send that to you, and you'll be able to complete it then. And you can come back to the videos once you have that. But if it's a question about what to do, just email me and I'll be glad to get back with you on what we need to do to get you moving forward with the rest of your pieces. But once you have them all sewn together and we're in a spot where they're trimmed and you're ready to get going, the thing that you will need to guide this portion is your assembly guide for your block A1. That's what we're going to start with. And then you'll do block A2 in the same way. So here we have our assembly guides for block A1 and A2. So you can see A1 is here and A2 is here. And in order for us to put our pieces together, we're going to be able to use this assembly guide. Now there are 2 ways that it tells us how to put this together. And depending on if you want to use both or if you work better when you have a text to guide your direction that you're going or a picture, you can do it either way. So let's talk about what this assembly guide shows us. When we look at block A1, which is what we're doing now, it will show you that step 1, seam number 1, is to sew piece A1C to A1D. So let's just look at that. Here is my block A1C. And here is my block A1D. Now, if I want to sew these together, I can see that they sort of fit this way. And I can take them, put them right sides together, and pin them together and assemble that. Okay? Now, if I need to double check that I'm sewing them together the right way, or if I find a picture of what I'm doing easier, then I can come over here where I have laid out all my pieces to be set up exactly like they're shown here. And when I do that, you'll see that A1C is next to A1D. And you'll see this seam line is marked as seam number 1. So this is a picture of what you're told to do right here. Now, once I sew this, I'm going to take that heat erase pen and I'm going to make a check mark here to know that I have sewn seam 1 of block A1. And it would be this direction to sew C to D. Now when I sew those together, I can tell by that picture that this one is going to be to the left, C, and D is going to be to the right, because that's what it shows me in the picture. And the seam is going to connect them right here as they touch. I will put them right sides together, and this is the way I line them up. I use pins, And I sew over my pins, so I get these extra fine ones. I also have one pin in here, let me find him, that is nice and straight and long. And that makes it easier for me to line things up. So when I'm going to line it up, I'm going to line up intersections, and I'm going to line up the ends, which may also be an intersection, but it may just be the end. So when I get to the end here, right at that point of that end, I want to put this pin through here. Because I have a seam there, I want to look on this other side. And you see, I didn't land quite in the seam line. I am actually a thread or so in. So right next to that, I'm going to come back through again, and this time, I'm almost in the seam line. There we go. Well, we'll get it. Just keep after it till it works. There we go. Now we're in the seam line. We're not into the fabric that's from that seam. This again is the way they're going to go together. And so I want to put it right in here, and I want it to be in this seam line again, and I want it to be so it comes through right back here where you can see it coming through at that point. So once I get those two lined up, I'm then going to make sure that my pieces are running down the edge where they're going to be sewn together, lined up, and I'm going to have this long pin that I've stuck through here, I'm going to hold it so it's sitting straight up and down. And while it's sitting straight up and down, I'm going to take one of these pins that I sew over, the ultra fine ones, and I'm going to put that through there so it holds that in place, and it's going to be where it's supposed to be. In this spot, I have an intersection where I have a seam line. So I'm going to put this through here, and again, I want to be right in the seam line, and it's going to be on the gray seam line. And then I'm going to come over here, and remember that big fat place where we had all those seams come together? That is the point that I want this seam line to match up to. So I'm going to put it right there at that tip where those seams come together. I'm going to hold that straight up and down, just like I did there at the corner, and I'm going to put me a pin in here. Now, because you're using ultra fine pins, and this is a pretty thick seam, you might want to try 2 or 3 spots real close to this pin to get it to go in so that you can get it through that thickness, but it will hold it so that you can sew over it properly. When I get down to this end, one of the things I want to be careful of is there's no seam here holding this fabric to this paper. So I could pick this up and see how this is offset. I could accidentally pick it up where it's scooting it, and it's going to create a tuck in here in fullness. So you want to be sure that when you're putting this together, that you have this fabric actually lined up with the paper where you cut it, because that's where it's supposed to be. Hold it in place and then put this pin into the point so that it goes through both the fabric and the paper with them still lined up. Again, on this side, we still didn't have a seam on this side either. So again, we want to make sure that's lined up really well. And then I'm going to take my thumb and put my fingernail right there towards that tip. That's going to help me to guide this pin so it comes out in the right place, because it'll make it come out pretty close, and I'll have fewer trial and errors to get it in the right spot if I do that. All right, so we've got it in the right place. We'll turn it back up this way, and I'm going to hold that nice and straight, and I'm going to pin those in place. So that's all lined up. Now, if this were a long run, I would go ahead, and we'll just do it on this side just to demonstrate it, even though it's not a real long run. I would go ahead and stick my pin in here at the seam and make sure it comes out at this seam. Look at how much off that is, because one got trimmed closer than the other. So I'm going to scoot it this way a little bit, put it back in there, and look, now it came through in the right spot. I can stand that up straight because this is not an intersection, and I don't have to hold it as I sew through it. Then I can just clip this and take my clip off as I approach it, because I'm really just holding this so that the seam doesn't shift. It's not a specific point it has to be at. So once I have this set up, I can now sew beginning on the white line that I used to line up to trim, and I can sew all the way down through here. Now, here's what I like to do. I'm going to flip this clip this direction, holding it in place like I had it. I like when I have a straight line that is the intersection, and when I have several lines coming together, I like to, when possible, sew on the side that's going to have all these intersections coming together. If you have done traditional quilting without paper, one of the things you may have learned to do is to line up points when they come together, oftentimes with a half square triangle, something similar to that. So if you have those and you can see where they all come together and you sew across that point, then you are up against that spot so that you haven't got a lot of float from one side to the other. You cut off your tips or left too much float in there. So by doing that, we're able then to get closer to an exact sew over of that intersection. And that's the reason I prefer to sew where I have multiple lines coming together when I have that on one side or the other. Sometimes I have multiple lines on both sides, and I have to rely on the fact that I line them up for it to work. And sometimes I have some on one side and some on the other, and I simply have to choose one. But when I have the option, I choose where I have an intersection that I can see where the points come together. So we're going to take this to the machine now. I am going to make a change. When I sew these segments together, I remove my open toe foot. And I take my 1/4 inch foot. My 1/4 inch foot, you'll notice, does not have the metal ledge on it here. I have one of those and I use it sometimes. But when I'm sewing on paper, and I might catch the paper depending on how my trimming went, I'm going to sew without one of those because I can still see that I'm lining up with the edge of the foot, and I'm going to be sewing on the line. So it gives me two indicators, but I don't have that metal ledge on there that might grab the paper. So I'm going to put this foot on my machine, and I'm going to try and do it with this camera. I'm still pointing this direction. There we go. And in this case, I start with the needle down. So I'm going to put the needle in the down position. I'm going to have my leader ender connected, and I'm going to take my paper and essentially push it almost right up against that needle. Now, one of the things to watch for here is you have feed dogs that grab your fabric and pull it through your machine. When you sew these two pieces together, the paper is going to be on the outside of both of them. And so instead of having the grip of texture in your fabric for the feed dog to grab, it's going to be trying to grab that paper. Because it's newsprint, it'll be a little more successful. But you may have to help it as it goes through a little bit with either the way you got it with your hands or a stiletto. And when you get to this lump that we're going to get to where all those seams came together, you're going to need to go a little bit slow so that you can go over that. And you may need to help it through a little bit with your stiletto so that between the feed dogs grabbing paper and the thickness, it may need just a little bit of help. So let's see how this goes. I still have my speed on a little slower, and I need to give it a little bit of a push here to get it going because the paper doesn't grab as well as the fabric with the feed dog. And I sew over that pin. Now, it's not a strong matching point where I have the clip. So when I get towards the clip, I'm going to pull it off and put it away. And I'm going to continue my sewing. Again, I'm working to kind of stay on the line, and I'm using the edge of my 1/4 inch foot as a secondary guide and indicator. And as I approach this massive intersection, I'm going to try and stay on the line, and I'm going to try and cross over where all of those points came together. That will give me the best option to be able to make them match. Not cut off a point where it's not necessary, and to not leave too big a gap. I'm going to go all the way down to the end, and then just like when I was sewing the other, I'm going to clip that, come back here, and I'm going to feed that through there. So it's ready for the next one to come. Once I take my pins out, one of the things I want to do before I do any pressing or anything is I want to open this up and see how successful I was in getting it to match in the right places. So I lined it up and I paid attention to what I was doing. If I just kind of fold this over here without doing pressing, then I can see that I have an intersection match right here. Get the stiletto again to make it a little easier to see. So I have a match here. I have a match here where I had that big bulk, and my points are still pretty pointy, and this line is lining up with them. So I feel comfortable with that. And then down here, I just want to see that because there was no seam here to line this up, the main thing when I press this is to make sure that I don't leave a tuck or fullness in this seam line. So now that I know that it's lined up in a way that I'm happy with it, now if you sew it, and if you say, oh my, I think I could have got a tiny bit more of that tip not to tuck in there and to show better, then you can pull those seams out and you can realign that and sew it again. In the big scheme of things with these types of quilts with so many seams and the quilting on top of it, I don't notice that when I'm looking at the quilt. And so I am happy with this and I'm okay with it. You do what makes you happy. If every time you look at this quilt, you're going to see that spot and say, I just wish I had redone that, redo it now. If you believe you can overlook that and be happy, then you do what I'm doing and just pull this paper out. Now, you don't pull all the paper at this point because we're going to need these seam lines later on when we're attaching some other things. But you can take it out of that seam line. So when you press this, you've gotten the bulk of the paper out of the way. See how easy that pulls off? Now, if for some reason you're having difficulty pulling your paper, there are a couple things you can do. If you have a stiletto like this, you can use it and just kind of run it down the seam line to do an extra perforation. If you don't have a stiletto that will do that, then, and I use this for a stiletto sometimes too, even feeding it through and take that point. But you can take the back, take your seam ripper, don't take it this away, don't poke it down in here like this, but just take the back and rub that across that seam line because you're not breaking the threads, you're simply creasing the paper more, perforating it more as you go through. And when you do that, then this paper is going to come right off of there with no problem at all. Now, when you have these little pieces like this, just to get a hold of them to try and pull them off, you may have to kind of scratch at them. But you can pull them off this way. And you want to make sure that all the paper, even if they got into some tucks, as you're doing multiple pieces together, you want to make sure all of that paper in that seam line comes off. See how it just kind of catches more with more seams coming across it there? And so I'm just going to take the stiletto and tug at that paper a little until I get it loose. Okay? Now once I do that, I'm going to take this to the ironing board. And in this case, because this seam is so thick, this is naturally wanting just to lay this direction. So I'm going to let it lay to the side. If it were standing up more in multiple places, I would open this seam and I would press it open. But in this case, it's wanting to lean to one direction. If I'm putting two blocks together, I don't know how they're going to meet up with other blocks, so I always open the seam. But if I'm putting segments together that are going to go into a block, then I will let it either lean that direction that it wants, or I will open it if it acts like it wants to stand up and not lean. So oftentimes if you have heavier bulk on both sides, you'll need to press it open. Now if I press this and I'm going to press it all to one side, then I'm going to put my acorn starch line right down here. If I were pressing this open, I would open it like this and put my acorn starch down the center of this seam. So in this case, we're going to do it this way. So I will take my acorn starch, press it to prime it, and just pull it across here. But when I press it, I'm going to lay it down this way and press it from the top because I'm trying to keep from getting any tucks, especially where I didn't have a seam line. Now we're going to move to the ironing station and I'll show you how I press that and where I watch for that seam line. Okay, so I've got it here. I'm pressing this direction, so I'm going to lay it so this one is folding over. And then I'm going to go to the ends, this end down here and this end down here, and I'm going to push those a little bit before I do the center because the tucks will typically come at the ends of a seam. So you want to make sure that you're getting those. And I'm doing this until I get that starch dry. Okay? Now once I did this, you can see that I have the seam pressed over. Down at this end, I do not have a tuck. And at this end, I also do not have a tuck at this end. There we go. So with that, I've got everything lined up, and these two segments are sewn together. Okay, now that I've sewn them together, I like to take just a little snip, and these little, I call them rabbit ears, that stick out, I like to trim them off. It just gets a little extra bulk out of there before I go to sew anything else on it. And again, this is just a little bit of waste here that we can toss. So you can see on the front how this is going to look. This is right side up, and this will be on the front. And then you can see on the back how it will look. And you can tell that this is piece C and D, just like here. This is seam line 1, and here is seam line 1. Now what I want you to continue to do and put together block A is I want you to continue to take your pieces and sew them together in this sequence. If you need to look at the sequence over here, you can check off that we've done seam 1, and you can go to seam 2, which is going to tell us to sew block A1B to block A1, I'm sorry, I'm down on seam 3. On seam 2, sew block A1 CD, and the reason it says CD is we've joined those already, right, in step 1, to block A1E. So this is our block CD, and as you can see, they're right here, and block A1E is here, and seam line 2 is right here. So you can see that will be the next step. And then you'll do the same thing once you've done this and pressed it. You will sew seam 3, which takes this same unit and connects it to A1B. Once you've completed that, you're going to look for seam line 4. You can look over here to tell you you're looking for A1F to A1G. So now we're going to leave this one alone that we've done, and we're going to connect these two, A1F and A1G. You can see that's seam 4. Then seam 5 will take this unit you've created and this unit you've created, and they'll be connected with seam 5. Once you have this larger piece, you'll be able now to sew seam 6 and connect A1A to the larger unit you've created. And then your final step will be to come over to seam 7 and add A1H to create this corner. Once you've done that, we'll use our square up template that we have for our blocks, and we will lay it down on the block to ensure that everything is trimmed properly. As long as it doesn't stick out over the edges and anything that sticks out is trimmed, you'll be ready now to move on to block A1B. So I'm going to leave you at this point. I'm going to let you get your blocks sewn together. Use the email address on the screen if you need to ask me any questions. Send me an email to get some clarification or a problem you've run into or something you don't understand, and I'll get back with you so we can do that. And then I'll come back here when we're ready to join the two blocks together, A1 and A2. That will complete our month 1. So we're having fun. We're getting to sew now, which is the fun part. Prep always has to be done before we can sew in any kind of quilt making. But once we get to the point where we start sewing, the fun begins. And what's really amazing is once we get these put together and we start to turn them over and see our quilt come to life. So we'll do that. And once our quilt starts coming to life, we're going to sit here and look at it and enjoy it and be ready and with lots of anticipation for month 2 to come along. Welcome back. I trust you have assembled blocks A1 and A2 and you have those all put together and you're ready to join your two blocks together so that we can have month 1 complete. To do this, I want you to go ahead and get your assembly guide for the quilt. Now, if you'll remember from our first video, we have in the month 1, we have the pattern side assembly guide for the entire quilt, and we also have a pattern side assembly guide for just this month, blocks A1 and A2. You can use either one of these. We're just looking to make sure that you have the pattern side version, not the finished side version, and that you can take a look at these to see where blocks A1 and A2 fit. So when we look at them on the entire quilt, we see row A and columns 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we're looking at 1 and 2. Those are the same thing, just not blown up as big as you see on this month's blocks. I'm going to go ahead and use the entire quilt one because if you do a legit kit that is not a block of the month, you'll want to be able to do this with the assembly guide for the quilt that is for the entire quilt. So if we look at A1 and A2 from the pattern side assembly guide, what we see is that A1 is going to lie to the left and A2 will lie to the right. Now when we flip those over and we have the finished side up, they'll be opposite. But when we're assembling them, it's important that we keep them with the pattern side orientation. So we are going to put A1 on the left and A2 on the right. And I've already sewn mine together because we sew these together in the same way that we sew segments to create the block. So if you'll remember, when we sewed the segments together, we looked for intersections and we looked for corners. We matched those up and we used a pin to go through both layers and get that aligned so that everything aligned beautifully. And then we align both the corners and the intersections. You can see when you look at blocks A1 and A2 next to each other that I had a corner on both ends. I had an intersection here that I lined up. I had an intersection here that I lined up. But you'll also notice I had some seams that came together in the center that did not have anything to align to. They were against a straight edge. That's okay. That will happen on occasion. And then here I had seams that lined up that did not have multiple intersections or were not at an angle. They were straight across. So you'll find some straight across, some angled, and some that have multiple seams that come to a point. When you put two blocks together, you may have some of these or all of these or none of these in a block. Every once in a while, in a larger quilt in the primarily background areas, you may have only the two corners to match. In those cases, you'll want to match up some seam lines and put some clips on there. Because these were actual seams that matched, we wanted to make sure that we lined them up, and we used a pin that we were going to sew over in order to do this. Now, once we sewed this together, just like we sewed two segments together, we opened it up and we made sure that we had matching spots and that we were okay with those. And as long as we're okay with them, we can move forward. And if we're not, just like before, we would remove that seam and we would stitch that again. So we're okay with the way these matched. Once we knew that they matched, we did just like we did with segments. We removed the paper within the seam line on both sides, made sure we got all that off. But in this case, rather than seeing if the seam would naturally fall to one side or the other, or if it sort of stood up because it had thicknesses, because I'm going to be joining rows and columns together, and I don't know which way the ones that touch this may tend to lean, I always press those block seams when I join them open. So in this case, I spread this open, I put my acorn starch down the center, and I pressed it open. You'll notice that I've left the papers in here. Now technically, if you wanted to, you could take all of the papers that are not going to be joined to something else. So the top edge of this, except for this seam line where A2 will join to A3 as we finish assembling the quilt, all of these papers could be removed. You could remove them as far down, making sure that you leave this seam line here so that we have this to line up and to stitch on. You could remove them there. I choose to leave them in at this stage because I'm still going to be joining something to these blocks. Sometimes I wait until the entire quilt is assembled before I take any paper out that is not in the seam line. If it's a large quilt, there are times that once I have joined every block that is going to touch that one. So in the case of A1, it will touch A2 and it will touch B1. So if I were going to remove the papers before the end of the quilt, I personally would want to have B1 and A2 both attached to A1 before I remove the papers from A1. So it's your choice which way you want to do it, but I do want you to make sure that if you start removing extra papers, any seam line you're still going to attach to another block down this side of A2 and across the bottom of both blocks. I want you to leave that paper in, because that paper will help us have this seam line marked so that it's easier for us to stitch once we begin to assemble those to the other blocks that they'll be touching. So once we've done this, then we are finished with block A1, or I'm sorry, month 1, blocks A1 and A2. So once you have these all finished, I like to turn them over so I can enjoy what it is that I have created. And I like to have, as I told you last time, the picture of the finished quilt depiction up on my design wall. And then I put these blocks up on my design wall so that I can enjoy them as I do the rest of the months. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back to show you what that looks like. So welcome back. I've been able to get my 2 blocks from this month that I've joined together up on the wall. So as I mentioned, we had A1 in the pattern side on the left and A2 on the right, and I told you that would reverse once we flipped them over to the finished quilt size. So I've taken my finished quilt size assembly guide and I've put it right underneath this for the moment, just so that we can compare and look. So if you look at this finished quilt side, this is the fabric upside. And I like to take a look at what I've assembled compared to this once I put it on the design wall. You can tell A1 is in the far right corner of my quilt, upper corner. And then next to that is A2 to the left. When I look at this design, I can see the design come through up here. And I can see it again in A2. So I can tell that I've assembled my blocks correctly. I can tell that they are looking like they're supposed to, and that they're oriented into the right place for the quilt. I've left space on my design wall for the other 2 blocks in row A once they're completed. And I keep this depiction of the quilt on the design wall so that I can continue to compare as I go along and create my quilt. Now, we will get blocks in a particular order that is chosen by the company because this is a block of the month. When we go to assemble the quilt, it's recommended we do that in quadrants. This will be 4 rows by 4 columns, and so we will end up assembling these 2 blocks, and then blocks B1 and B2. When they are complete, when we receive them and we complete them, we'll put those up here and we'll put those together with this, and that will create 1 quadrant of our quilt. We'll then put together, as we receive them, we'll be doing A3 and 4 and then B3 and 4. Those will go over here, we'll join them all together, and they will become a quadrant. And we'll do the same with rows C and D in these versions. At the end, once we have all our blocks assembled for the entire quilt, we're going to then sew the first 2 quadrants together and the next 2 quadrants together, or because this is a horizontal quilt instead of vertical with the way the rectangle is shaped, we will likely sew this quadrant to this one. So columns 3 and 4 on all the rows will get sewn together, and then we'll do the same with columns 1 and 2. By doing that, we keep shorter seams, and we never have to sew this real long seam across here. Sewing it can be a little cumbersome, but the real fun is pinning it. And so it's easier when you pin a shorter seam. So the shorter we can keep the seam, the easier the pinning is and the stitching. And so we'll be prepared for that when we get there. This has been fun. We already have the beginnings of a beautiful quilt, and I want you to work on yours, get it complete for this month if you can. There's nothing that says that if you don't get it done this month, the world will come to an end. You've got all the time in the world to get this done. But we will attack the month 2 blocks when they arrive, and I hope that you're anticipating them as much as I am. We'll have fun then and join me again. Any questions or comments, please send them to me in the email listed on the video, and I will be happy to get back to you. So have some fun, and I'll see you again soon.